Coming up on this episode of Crime Family.
We are now on part 3 of the Long Island serial killer case. This episode I'm going to get into some of the issues with the Suffolk County Police Department that really hindered the investigation for years. So together they tried to find anything they could use to blackmail other detectives, using wiretaps, tracking their vehicles. They just really were not the people that you would want in charge of anything, especially a police force. And it came to light that there was evidence of coerced confessions, illegal wiretaps, and preferential treatment for people close to public officials. And so he was supposed to be the head of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, but he was in on this cover-up as well.
I'm just in shock right now.
There's just a lot of shady behavior, and there's no accountability.
Hey everyone, welcome to Crime Family. I'm Katie, and I'm here with my brother and sister, AJ and Steph, and we are now on part 3 of the Long Island serial killer case. And if you haven't already, go back and listen to the first 2 episodes because we kind of get into the background and what kind of got this whole case started. So you're definitely going to want to have some of that background information going into this part 3 episode. So I'm just going to get right into it because we got a lot to go over, like usually. So this episode, I'm going to get into some of the issues with the Suffolk County Police Department that really hindered the investigation for years. Once I get going, it's really frustrating to realize that the killer could have possibly been caught years earlier if only there was dedication put towards this case from the get-go, and if there was less corruption. I mean, maybe not no corruption, but even if there's just a little bit less corruption, maybe it could have went a little bit faster. So yeah, I'm going to kind of get into a lot of that. So in a New York Times article by Robert Kolker from November 3rd, 2023, titled "The Botched Hunt for the Gilgo Beach Killer," it goes into a lot of the details on the police investigation and why it was kind of botched from the beginning. So right from the get-go, I guess the police knew that the killer used burner phones, which we talked about in the previous episodes. And of course, these are hard or impossible to trace. And they also knew that the killer used tape to wrap up the victims and burlap for some of them. And they found a couple hairs in the tape that could possibly be used to find DNA. And they also found a belt at the scene that had the initials HM or WH. And they also had that description of one of the clients of one of the victims named Amber Costello. We talked about her in the previous episodes. So they had that description that some witnesses saw of her client, which we mentioned. So he looked like an ogre. He was a white man, at least 6'4", in his late 40s with bushy dark hair. And he drove a green Chevrolet Avalanche. And police began looking into this vehicle, but it really didn't go anywhere. When they couldn't find any matches in the DMV databases, the investigators just kind of let this lead wither away, and they didn't continue to talk to potential other eyewitnesses who may have seen Amber's last client. They didn't pass on this avalanche tip to other higher-up agencies. And Robert Kolker reported that a senior police official who was familiar with this case during the first year of the investigation said that he was not even aware of the Chevrolet Avalanche tip, and it kind of got buried for years. Further to this, even though it seems obvious to anyone kind of looking into this case that it was the work of a serial killer. The Suffolk County Police Commissioner at the time, Richard Dormer, he did not want to admit that to the public for whatever reason. And in one news conference, he says, quote, "I don't want anyone to think we have a Jack the Ripper running around Suffolk County with blood dripping from a knife," end quote. And so, of course, while this literally was not the case, there was actually someone targeting and killing sex workers on Long Island. So you'd think that that would kind of be a priority to let the public know about, but they just didn't feel like that was necessary. In the beginning, there were no suspects, there were no persons of interest, and not even anyone was brought in for questioning in the beginning. And it made many wonder, how could someone go undetected when they clearly had at least some sort of digital trail with those burner phones? And of course, we talked about this before in previous episodes, that the whole point of a burner phone is that it's hard to trace. Like, that's why a lot of people have them. But surely they could at least find out what cell towers they were pinging off of, see if there was any connections or patterns. Like, this seems like an obvious thing that you could look at and maybe find a connection really early on. This is what the FBI did try to do in the beginning, but it just kind of baffles some people about why it just didn't go anywhere for so long.
This was one of the things when I was researching this case that I really had a hard time understanding the process of why they couldn't ping cell phone towers. Because even though it's a burner phone, all cell phones have a signal, right? So it was really frustrating to me, like super confusing. I didn't understand why no one looked further into it or no one did anything about it.
Yeah, I'm going to explain why that happened, and you'll understand why, even though it was like relatively normal thing to do, why it just didn't go anywhere for so long. So I'm going to get into that.
And I feel like maybe the police, they weren't as active. I think we talked about this in the previous episodes, but they probably weren't as active. I know, like, when you look at the profile of the victims, they're like marginalized people, like sex workers. I don't feel like they're at the top of the list for high priority cases. So maybe that was part of it. And also, I don't know. I mean, I feel like every case we do, it's like there's something where somebody screws up somewhere along the line. But I found that too with the cell phone signals. Yes, there were burner phones, but that's not an excuse. There's still a signal coming from a burner phone. I mean, it might be harder to detect, but I feel like you still can detect it.
Because I feel like in like other cases that we've done or other cases that I've seen or documentaries that I watched, that they can trace burner phones. So like I just don't understand why they either didn't or couldn't. It just seems very odd to me.
Yeah, so you can, I guess, technically trace a burner phone, but just because it's not, you can't exactly necessarily find the phone number of that burner phone, or it's not linked back to an owner, right? Like if you lost your iPhone, someone could look that up and be like, oh, so-and-so owns this. This is their address, their name, their phone number. But a burner phone would just be like a dead end. So you couldn't trace it in that sense. But yeah, it definitely would ping off signals. Obviously, it uses cell towers. Like that is an obvious thing that would still happen with a burner phone. So it's not impossible, but yeah, a lot harder, and just something that just didn't happen as fast as it needed to in this case.
Yeah. And I think that that's the point of a burner phone, right? Is that it's not connected to an account. Because obviously, if someone's using a burner phone and they're calling, like remember we talked about they called that victim's family with like the taunting calls. Obviously, you're not going to do that on a phone, like an iPhone. You're going to do it with a burner phone that can't be traced. So I feel like that's the point of it, is that it's not connected to you, but it still bounces off towers.
Yeah, exactly. That is the whole point of a burner phone usually. Yeah, so like you just said about how it felt like there wasn't a sense of urgency in this case, as most of the victims were sex workers. And so, yeah, in Kolker's New York Times article, he writes about this as well. And so when speaking to the public, the chief of detectives said that it should be seen as a consolation that the killer was, quote, not selecting citizens at large. He's selecting from a pool, end quote. So this seems to really show the chief's true thoughts on sex workers. Obviously, yes, if you're not a sex worker, then you're not the target, but he could still be targeting your daughter, your sister, your mother. And what if you are a sex worker? Like, it must feel awful to hear the police say, oh, don't worry about it. He's only killing sex workers. Like, that's not a good point. Like, you know what I mean? They're still people. They're still, someone needs to protect them. They're still someone's family.
I feel like sex workers are like they're in a dangerous job. I felt like one of the most dangerous jobs out there. So, like, it always gets me frustrated when police officers don't see them as real people. They just see them as, oh, they're just sex workers. Well, that's, like, they're so human. It always makes me so mad because, yes, it's a different profession than most people would like to see people doing, but they're still people. They're still making money. They're still out there. So it's not like they're not people.
Yeah, and it's like the common sentiment is that we've seen. It's like, you know, it's like the victim blaming. It's like, well, if you didn't become a sex worker, you wouldn't be a target. It's like, yeah, but these women were sex workers. They're dead, and this person not being caught, it's going to put other people at risk going forward. So, and it doesn't mean they're still human. They still have families. So, yeah, we see that all the time though. Like marginalized people are just not very important to the police. But
you can't just kill sex workers and then like not get found or caught. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like saying like, oh, the police sometimes are killing sex workers. Like, who cares? Well, obviously people care. Like, you want this person caught because if he's killing sex workers, he may go out and kill other people too.
Yeah, and he's killing people. Like, it doesn't matter what kind of people they are. Like,
yeah.
That would just be like someone being like, oh, don't worry, they're only killing children. It's like, well, you know, I have a kid. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, it's like they're not targeting you.
yeah, but they're only killing seniors.
Yeah, right? They're only killing fathers. Like, okay.
Yeah.
Somebody cares about that person that they're targeting. So it still matters. Like, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like irrelevant that they were sex workers because I even see a lot of articles that when I'm researching this case, it's like man accused of killing 4 sex workers or whatever. Like it's always like in the title or it's mentioned. It's like just 4 people. How about just 4 people?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, it's crazy how they treat them. And another thing that came up in this article was it's kind of like you were saying, victim blaming. It's like, well, these aren't the words I'm paraphrasing, but it's kind of like, well, they're asking for it because they're willing to get in strangers' cars and go random places with them in the middle of the night. It's like, well, yeah, but that doesn't mean they deserve to be killed. So
yeah, exactly.
That could be anybody. Anybody could be out and like someone said, oh, like, do you want to drive somewhere? Like, I know somebody in your family.
I know.
Get in. It could be anybody. It doesn't have to be like sex workers.
And also, I feel like 90% or more people who are sex workers don't want to be sex workers. Like it's usually of circumstances or maybe like, I mean, maybe there are some people who enjoy that type of work, but I mean, most people, it's like marginalized people. They're desperate for money. They might have other, you know, mental health or addiction issues or whatever. Like nobody is like growing up wanting to be a sex worker. So it's like, it's almost irrelevant that they are. It's like that was the situation they were in. And there's still people who are in that dangerous profession. And someone is targeting them to kill them. So
yeah, I know. That's what I was going to say. No one's dream growing up is to be a sex worker. It's just kind of the situation that they're in. And it's how they're trying to survive. So, I mean, yeah, it's not like they're loving this life and, you know, it's a big party. It's a hard life and it's super dangerous.
Going back to like what you're saying about like them going up to strangers and getting into the cars, it's like, well, that could be anybody. Getting into a cab or an Uber, if those people are strangers to you, you don't know who they are.
Yeah, that's true. So
yeah, that would be like saying, don't get into an Uber. You asked for it. You're getting into a car with a strange person. Yeah, but it's like, yeah, but that's not the expectation when you take an Uber to be killed.
Like, don't go on the bus because there's strangers there.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just not a good situation, not a good thing to say. So the Suffolk County Police did eventually come around and they began to think that all 10 of the bodies found could be the work of one serial killer. But the district attorney at the time, Thomas Spoda, he didn't agree. So he announced in a press conference that this area that they were finding all the bodies was the dumping ground for many years. And there was no evidence that it was all one killer and it could be up to 3 killers, he said. So apparently, the police commissioner and the DA at the time, they were supporting opposing political parties. And because of that, they just kind of were always going head to head and fighting about things. And so they just weren't supporting each other either during this investigation or with their messages to the media. So for the public, these mixed messages likely were very confusing and made it look like the authorities really had no idea what was going on. Because, I mean, the police department saying it's one serial killer, the DA saying, oh, it could be up to 3. So it's like, well, what is happening out there, really? Robert Kolker wrote a book called Lost Girls on this case. So he is someone that knows a lot of info. He can go into a lot of detail. So a lot of what I'm saying is coming out of his New York Times article, but it's good information and I feel like it's a good source. I haven't read that book, but I feel like it's definitely going to be on my reading list. Yeah, so he says that it's obvious that the police were apathetic about the whole case from the beginning and that it quickly turned into, quote, willful ignorance and corruption, end quote. And he claims that everything that the police needed to solve this case, they had almost right from day one. So I'm going to go into a little bit about the history of the corruption in the Suffolk County Police Department, just so that you can get a good understanding of how they operated to kind of just shed some light on why this case was botched from the get-go. So one example that comes up is from the 1970s, and Suffolk County Police Department Homicide Unit had a 97% confession rate, which, I mean, when you think about it, that seems like a good thing, that they're getting people to confess, but kind of when you understand that that is unrealistically high, and it was unheard of, and it far exceeded the 54 to 73% rate in 6 comparable jurisdictions, including Nassau and Westchester counties at the time. And it came to light that there was evidence of coerced confessions, illegal wiretaps, and preferential treatment for people close to public officials, and, quote, the practice of sweeping law enforcement misconduct under the rug, end quote. So they're basically doing whatever they could to get confessions from people, whether they were the actual perpetrator or not. And they would even go around wearing shirts that said 97%. So, you know, just like arrogant with very little regard for the actual law. It's like we're going to get people to confess regardless of if they did it or not. So just, you know, not the way you want your police department to be acting. And so the police department was able to get away with so much with little oversight as it was able to gain a bit of political clout. So the department was large. It was one of the largest in the U.S., with about 2,500 officers. And as a union, if they decided to back up a political candidate, then that person had almost guaranteed success. And also, district attorneys who wanted a long and successful career would turn a blind eye to any police indiscretions, or just not look too hard at any misconduct. Or they would even use the police department for political power. So if the department was up to no good and the district attorney overlooked that, then they could count on the department's political support. So when you have no accountability, it really is a slippery slope. Also, during this investigation, the district attorney at the time, Thomas Spoda, had assigned a new police chief named James Burke. And these two had a history, so Thomas Spoda and James Burke. Decades prior, when James Burke was only 14 years old in 1979, he was a witness who testified in a murder case that Thomas Spoda was the prosecutor for. And years later, participants in that case came forward and said that they had been coached to lie on the stand. But Spoda denied any wrongdoing and he was never actually charged with anything, but his bond with Burke stayed throughout the years for whatever reason. This makes me think, like just speculation, that maybe Burke wasn't one of the ones that turned on him and said that he was being coached to lie. Like maybe he supported Spoda the whole time. Like I don't know that for sure, but it just makes me think that that could have been a reason why Spoda kind of like took a liking to him early on. And then in 1993, while Burke was a police officer, there was an internal affairs investigation against him because he was accused of patronizing and smoking crack with a sex worker. And Spoda offered to represent him, as Spoda was in private practice at the time. And Burke was punished. He lost 15 vacation days. But when Spoda became the district attorney in 2002, he actually gave Burke a senior role. And then once he had the chance, he assigned Burke as the police chief in 2012. So these two were very buddy-buddy with each other. They both kind of have sketchy allegations against them in the past. And they just really were not the people that you would want in charge of anything, especially a police force.
Only losing 15 vacation days after smoking crack and patronizing a sex worker? Like, what the hell?
Yeah, is that how the police are punished? Is removal of vacation days?
I don't know, how many vacation days do they get? Like 15 vacation days? Like, is that all their vacation days?
I know. That's how much I get in a year.
I know, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but just seems like a little slap on the wrist, like, oh, don't smoke crack with sex workers anymore while you're working, kind of thing. So, kind of a little bit ridiculous, but that's how it went. So, despite what was happening kind of with the heads of the police department, the police were still doing some work on the investigation. They were looking at cell records, and they did have an idea of where the killer might be operating out of. They were seeing patterns that led them to believe that he might be someone who commuted between central Long Island and midtown Manhattan, as they were getting cell tower hits from midtown Manhattan near the Queensboro Bridge and near Massapequa Park in Long Island. And the FBI were also called in, and they had the technology to really help track the burner phones, and there would be a massive amount of data obtained when looking into all the surrounding cell towers. So the police department really needed all the help they could get with all this data that would be coming in. When you think about that, it'd be like millions of calls and pings off cell towers every day. So they really had a lot ahead of them. So the FBI had been able to isolate specific geographic locations by tracing the signals from the killer's burner phone. And one location was central Long Island, which included Massapequa Park, and one in midtown Manhattan, like I was just explaining. So the FBI's next step was to search the cell phone data for cell numbers that pinged at the exact same time and place as the killer's burner phone, because the theory was that whoever was using those burner phones likely had another personal cell phone that even if they weren't using at the time, if it was still turned on, then it would still be picked up by the cell tower. And so they would potentially use that number to trace it back to the killer. So that was like a technique I didn't actually think of. But yeah, they're trying to look for these burner phones and then find another actual cell phone that was registered that had the exact same activity. That seems like a super smart technique. However, back in early 2012, Spoda told the FBI that they didn't need their help, and they asked the FBI to step down from the case. And when that happened, he didn't pursue the cell phone data any further. And one of his reasonings was that the killer would be too smart to live so close to the dumping ground. And just because the killer made the calls from that area doesn't mean he lived there. But I'm thinking, like, you could still trace the actual phone numbers and see if it did lead back to someone with a name and address. Like, why not even try that? But he also said that it would just take up too many resources to have to comb through a massive amount of data when it wasn't even a sure thing that it would turn up any results. So he's like, oh, it's just too big of a task. Let's not even bother trying. So that's one of the explanations as to why the cell phone data was there, but they just didn't look into it.
I never even thought of like that technique that they were using was like matching the activity of the burner phone with like an active cell phone that's registered. Because that's really smart. Like, this person obviously has a real cell phone that they're using that will be registered in their name, and they're not going to really go. I mean, maybe they would if they have a burner phone, but a lot of the places they go, their actual phone is going to be with them too. So I feel like that's a really smart technique. I never would have thought of that, but obviously I'm not an investigator, but that's smart.
Yeah, exactly. And as a killer or somebody, you might not think of that either, that your phone is going to be getting picked up at the exact same time with the exact same activity. So
yeah, because you're thinking they're going to be looking at it to this burner phone's activity. If anything, they're not going to think to also look at my real phone's activity as well.
Well, because that's why you have burner phone, right?
Like, yeah, exactly. And there's going to be so many other phones that are being picked up and pinging off the towers at the same time as yours. So it's like, how are they going to, now I'm going to think about that. So yeah, that matching up like the exact data from these two different phones is like a smart technique.
Yeah. Someone who's really smart, I guess, would just leave their like legitimate phone like at their house and then only use the burner phone.
Yeah, or turn it off completely
Yeah.
so it wasn't pinging,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah. So like I said, Spoda didn't want to spend money and resources looking into all that data, but he did use those resources.
Didn't want to do his job.
No, exactly.
He was lazy. He didn't want to do all the work.
Yeah, it was going to take too much money and too much time. It's not like he was doing it himself. Like, he would have other people to do it. But no, he didn't want to, quote unquote, waste his resources on that.
Also, it's not like it's his money anyway.
I know, right? It's the police department's money and the police department's manpower. But no, he had other priorities. He wasn't going to use the resources for that, but he was going to use them for his own agenda. So he would have his staff investigate his rivals or anyone's life that he just felt like disrupting. Like, he would have police officers go and just follow people and let them know that they were being watched for whatever reason. So Burke also devoted very little time to the case and a lot of resources elsewhere. So I'm going to read an excerpt from Robert Kolker's New York Times article that I've been talking about, again, from November 3rd, 2023, titled The Botched Hunt for the Gilgo Beach Killer. So it says, quote, "In the 4 years that Burke ran the police department from 2012 to 2015, the Gilgo room at Suffolk County headquarters became a place for part-time work with little urgency dictated from above. Under Burke, the police were in what would be later characterized by federal prosecutors as a complete ethical freefall. His staff served drinks in his office every night. He ordered officers to spy on his girlfriend, her exes, and her son, and followed his perceived adversaries, including Steve Billon, the county executive. He turned the police force into his own empire, punishing anyone he deemed disloyal and then celebrating with his friends after their demotion." End quote. So another example of the misconduct happened in December of 2012. There was a witness in another case who also happened to like to steal things out of police vehicles, and he stole a duffel bag out of Burke's vehicle that contained pornography, sex toys, cigars, a gun belt, and ammunition. And none of that is necessarily illegal, maybe just embarrassing for people to find out about, but it's how Burke reacted that got him into trouble. So he attacked this handcuffed witness in front of several other detectives, and then Burke and some of them all took part in beating the witness, and then they bragged about it later. Burke also tried to pressure witnesses, which were other detectives, into taking part in a cover-up once he was under federal investigation, and Spoda actually helped him. So together they tried to find anything they could use to blackmail other detectives, using wiretaps, tracking their vehicles. And because federal agents were in some of these wiretap recordings, legally, Spoda had to notify Loretta Lynch, who was then the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of New York, which he did. He did notify her, probably because he'd be in huge trouble if he wiretapped federal agents without telling them. So he did notify her, but once her team realized that the wiretaps really were far from related to any actual case, the feds expanded their investigation from just Burke to the whole Suffolk County Police Department as a whole. So finally, some things were actually happening for the betterment of the department and the public. And Loretta Lynch was actually appointed by Obama as the Attorney General in 2015. So there's not going to be any misconduct, with her in office. So at least we have like a good person that's like from the top looking down on all of this finally. In 2016, James Burke was indicted and pleaded guilty to conspiring to obstruct justice and violating the civil rights of that witness that he had beaten. And he served a sentence of 46 months in prison. And even more recently, in 2023, Suffolk County Park Rangers had set up a sting in Suffolk County Vietnam Veterans Memorial Park in Selden, as there were complaints of sex solicitation in the park. And in August of 2023, Burke was actually arrested during this sting, as he allegedly was soliciting a male prostitute and exposing himself to undercover officers. So yeah, that's not a good look. And as far as I know, 2 of the 4 charges against him have been dropped, but as of now, he has not been convicted. But there's still 2 charges against him, and he tried to use his name as, the former police chief to avoid being arrested, which did not work. And Spoda was also indicted on charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and other crimes. And he actually resigned the day after that indictment in 2017. And it wasn't until 2019 when he was convicted for trying to help Burke with that cover-up when Burke beat up the witness. And also convicted was the former chief of Spoda's Anti-Corruption Bureau, Christopher McPartland. And so he was supposed to be the head of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, but he was in on this cover-up as well. According to ABC 7 News, Spoda was sentenced in 2021 to 5 years in prison, and he was given a $100,000 fine.
Still doesn't seem like enough.
I know, right?
I'm just in shock right now of all of that stuff that they did.
it's kind of sad. I was going to say, like, I'm kind of at the point now where it's like not even shocking to me. It's like when we start to go into a case now, I'm starting to think, okay, where was the police corruption in this case? Like, to me, and that's sad to have to say that because there's so many cases where we see this.
I know. I feel the same. And it's like whenever I'm thinking about cases that have gone on for decades and years that haven't been solved, it's like, well, what's going on inside the police department that's distracting them from this case? Like, I feel like there's corruption. People just don't care. People are doing stuff. That's just where my mind goes now. Obviously, all police departments and all officers aren't corrupt, but it just makes you think, like, how much is actually out there.
And it's so frustrating for like the families as well because they just want to get answers. They want stuff happening, and which is why a lot of people just do their own investigation and hire a private investigator because they can't rely on their own police department to do the actual work for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you imagine being like a family member of one of these victims and then all this coming to light and realizing all the shit that was going down instead of them, trying to track down these killers? The chief of police is like using his resources to investigate or stalk his ex-wife for no reason just to see what she's up to. Like, that'd be so frustrating. Like, spending that money and time to do absolutely nothing of value. So you can't even like imagine how they must be feeling after all this came out.
Yeah, and I feel like in today's day and age with the amount of technology that's out there, the amount of stuff that police can do, I mean, there's so much like surveillance that just happens of normal citizens day to day. It's like, I feel like there's so many cases that could be solved quickly if they actually put their minds to it or like actually tried. Because I feel like there's a lot of just missed opportunities. I feel like, I mean, obviously there's going to be some cases where really are puzzling and just are a mystery, but like there's so many cases I feel like if they didn't have the corruption, if they didn't have the police being dumb or not apathetic, like there could be so many that are just solved right away. Like there's too much technology this day and age to really have an excuse for any of this.
I know. I feel like for a lot of cases, there really is. The answer is so close that they just had a little bit more focus and less corruption, that it wouldn't take as long as it has for some of these cases.
Yeah. And I feel like the police, it's not the NYPD, but like the police in the NYPD and also other in New York and all that stuff. Like, I feel like just like the level of corruption is probably just so out of the realm of people's knowledge or most people's knowledge. I feel like, and I don't even know even half of it, but like, you can just imagine the level of corruption that happens. Like, kind of they're all in like bed with politicians and like they're all like wrapped up in like mafia. I don't know. I mean, allegations, but I feel like there's just a lot of shady behavior and there's no accountability or very little accountability.
I know, it's so frustrating. And then we think about even in this case when, like I touched on a little bit, even investigators and officers that, weren't on Burke's side and the ones that he distrusted because he knew that they were actually good police officers, like he got them in trouble and they got demoted or pulled off the case and things. So they got punished for standing up and actually doing the right thing. So that'd be frustrating to be an actual good cop and getting shit on from above because of that. So
yeah. And when you said before, like how I think it was you said the DA and like the police chief or something were opposite political parties or something. So
yeah,
they were like always at odds. It's like,
yeah, they were fighting with each other. It's like, grow up. Like,
yeah, and
you're
it's
allowed to have disagreements.
Yeah. And like the system was like, I don't know. It's just, they're like each using the system to like get ahead in their own way. And everyone, the victims in all of these cases are victimized again because their murders go unsolved or their families go without answers.
Yeah, and it's like they're using like news and media conferences to fight. Like one of them says, "Oh, it is one serial killer," and then the next one comes on and it's, "Oh no, it's actually could be up to 3 killers." It's like these petty little fights in the news media, so it's a bit ridiculous.
Who cares how many serial killers were? That's not the point. The point is people died, and we need to find those people.
Yeah, I know.
And also, like, just get over yourself.
Well, yeah, and even if they did disagree on how many killers there were, like they could have had a press conference where they came together and said, our opinions are, it could be 1 to 3, like we don't know, but they didn't have to, be contradicting each other in this way where it was obvious that they just didn't agree. So obviously unprofessional and just super, super annoying and frustrating.
And also, you're never going to know how many serial killers there are if you don't actually investigate it.
Yeah, really. Oh.
So maybe like try to figure out how many there are. Do your job.
Yeah, maybe like shut up and get to work. So in 2019, this is what the new Suffolk County Police Commissioner Geraldine Hart had to say about Burke, Spoda, and Chris, as reported by ABC News in an article from December 7th, 2019. And Hart says, quote, "The very people charged with upholding the law were the ones who were found guilty of assisting James Burke in his attempt to get away with his crime. Instead of being leaders and standing up for justice, they did their best to manipulate the system and everyone who stood in their way. The actions of former District Attorney Thomas Spoda and his chief aide Christopher McPartland go against everything that this department stands for, and it is unfortunate that their illegal activities have cast a negative light on the public's perception of the police department. Instead of supporting the proud men and women of this department, this trio focused on corruption and cover-ups." End quote. So I think all of this kind of really paints a picture of how seriously the DA and the police chief took this case. They, obviously had other priorities, almost like they were just doing little bits here and there just to make it look like they cared and were doing their job. And so, yeah, like I was saying, if you're wondering why it took so long for them to solve this case, then that's a good reason why. They just did not give a shit. And they had all their own shit going on. So back to the actual investigation. Despite their lack of urgency or care for this case, some investigators did care, and they were still looking into it. Because like I said, the whole police department wasn't corrupt. The police were actually looking into hunting licenses. Because of the burlap sacks, they thought that the killer might be a hunter. But they didn't actually look into gun licenses, even though obviously a hunter would probably own a gun. The victims weren't shot, so they didn't have a lead there. So they just didn't look into gun licenses, which was obviously a mistake on their part, as we'll get into later. So in 2015, a new police commissioner was brought in named Tim Sinai, S-I-N-I. Right away, he brought the FBI back in to help with the cell phone data again. So he actually had a couple suspects that he was honing in on, but the other police officers in the force didn't like the fact that he had come in as an outsider and he was now the boss. He had never actually been a police officer himself. So there was a lot of pushback from the officers when Sinai tried to get them to look into certain things. Those two suspects that he had at the beginning were eventually ruled out, but it was almost as if the police officers just didn't look into them at all. The New York Times article explains that under Sinai's leadership, they had actually narrowed down the area where they believed the killer lived in Long Island, and there was only about 1,000 men in that area. So all they had to do was cross-reference these men to see which ones worked in another small portion that they had mapped out in Manhattan. And so, well, it's still a big task, 1,000 men, but it was definitely doable. But it just didn't get done in a timely fashion because these officers didn't like this new police commissioner coming in. So again, still stubborn, still kind of trying to push their own agenda, I guess. The FBI even threatened to leave the case because they were just so frustrated with the police department's lack of action. And in 2022, an interagency task force was dedicated to this case full time. So they finally have this group, this team that is going to be looking into this case full time. No, just part time, pick it up when you can kind of thing. And it involved state police, FBI, the sheriff's office, and Nassau County officers. And so finally, everyone could work together, talk about the case. They, had this group where they could bounce ideas and leads off of each other for the first time. And so also a big part of the problem with this case was that all the data and statements that officers and investigators had taken had never been digitized. So it was all handwritten notes. So you couldn't just put something into a database and then have these notes come up on the computer to be cross-referenced. Everything had to be kind of looked through on paper. So I think that was just part of the police department's apathy or just laziness with this case. They just didn't care or bother to put all that into a digital database. This task force was set up on February 15th, 2022. And on March 14th, 2022, so a month later, this is when the task force learned about that Chevy avalanche tip. So like I said, this tip was brought up from the beginning and it kind of got buried. But it took them a month to finally find this avalanche tip buried in the documents. they used different databases than were originally used when the police were trying to find who owned this Chevy Avalanche. And this database they used was available back in 2011 when the investigation began, but it was just never explored. And right away, they got a hit on that vehicle that matched the other criteria that they were looking for. And so the suspect that they were looking at used to own this vehicle. He lived and worked in the exact geographic locations that the FBI had identified years before. And he fit the description of the large ogre that witnesses had described. So they finally had a solid suspect, and all it took was a few weeks of cooperation within the task force.
Could you imagine, like, if they would just got their shit together and cooperated at the beginning, that this probably would have been solved, like, years ago?
I know.
Like, all it took was people doing their job.
Yeah, that's what I said. It was almost like everything they needed to solve this case, they almost had from the very beginning. And if they would have just got their shit together and, like, talked about it and put their, minds to it, they could have figured this out way sooner. But instead, because of all that stuff that was going on, this is how long it took. Because, yeah, like I said, it just took, like, a month of cooperation, and they had a suspect. This man's name was Rex Heuermann, and we will get into all the evidence against him in our next episode. So that's it for today. Make sure you come back next time.
Like AJ said earlier, like, I shouldn't be shocked about the corruption. It's just that, like, I feel like how many cases could have been solved earlier if this type of thing never happened. I'm just thinking in my mind, like, so many cases that we've done that had police corruption. I think all of them that we've done in all of our seasons that we've had. And it's just sad to think that, like, most of them could have been solved if people just did their jobs professionally and didn't have any other shit going on while doing their job. Like, it's just so sad to me. I can't wrap my head around it.
I know, it's crazy. And also, when I was starting to do the research for this, I was like, oh, am I even going to have enough for a full episode with just the police investigation stuff? And I mean, really, in reality, it probably wouldn't have, because it didn't actually take that long once they got their shit together. But all that other stuff that came out is why I think it was important to put in there, just to realize why it took so long and what was happening behind the scenes. So super frustrating for the families, like we said, that is why it took so long. Not because they didn't have evidence, not because they didn't have the resources, but because they, like, really just didn't care, and the people at the top were, shitty and corrupt.
Yeah. And I feel like Steph said, a lot of the cases that we've done have had some level of police corruption, and I feel like the ones that haven't and they're unsolved, it's probably like, well, we'll find out when it's solved, whenever that is, how much corruption there was, and that's why it took so long. So I feel like if there wasn't police corruption in any, then it's just hasn't come out yet. But maybe I'm just jaded. I don't know. I feel like I've covered so many with police corruption. I have, like, no faith in the police force anymore, which is the sad reality. But really, like, I mean, the FBI or, like, the police department really have any victims that, were killed after, like, the initial investigation began, when they pretty much had a lot of the info and they just didn't get their shit together. Like, they really have those victims' blood on their hands. So hopefully they can live with that, because that's the reality of it. I think, if they had gotten their shit together, then other people wouldn't have died. So
yeah, that's one thing, like, I forgot to mention. Like, we don't know if after all these bodies were discovered, if the killer actually was still killing. Could have been. And if they would have just caught him in the very beginning, once these bodies were discovered, then they could have saved a lot of lives, potentially. So, I mean, yeah, that's a super sad part about it as well.
Yeah. So, yeah, we'll get into kind of everything that happens or comes out based on this suspect that they arrest in 2023. So we'll get into that in our final part of the Long Island serial killer case coverage. So thank you so much for joining us for part 3. We hope you've enjoyed listening so far. You can follow us on all the social medias. We're on Instagram and Facebook at Crime Family Podcast. We're on Twitter at Crime Family Pod 1. If you want merch for the show, there's a link to the merch store in the show notes. Also, if you want to become a patron and get some bonus episodes and extra content, you can join the link that's in the show notes as well. And also, we have our email address. You can send us an email at crimefamilypodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your case suggestions or your feedback on the show. Leave us a review, leave us a rating on your podcast app that you listen to us. All that feedback is great, and we love to hear it, good or bad. So thank you so much, and we'll be back next week for our final part of this case and also the final episode of the season, which also happens to be our 100th episode. So it's a big episode next time, so we hope you'll join us next week for that. Until then, take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.